The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to our our fourth presentation of, oh my goodness, what's going on with me today? Welcome to our fourth presentation of Asset Management Awareness Month 2023. My name is Scott Ray, and I am the VP of Events and Seminars, and I'm happy to join you today. I am coming to you from a less rainy and a little bit more dry, partly cloudy sort of California, where we had a bomb cyclone yesterday, but we luckily did not have to pull out the scuba tanks or anything, so we are doing good here. So welcome in. So today we are presenting, or Yvonne Batcher has been gracious enough to present to us today on the essential aspects and keys to success in diverse work environments. But before we welcome in Yvonne and get to her presentation, just a couple things to point out to you all. Similar to past presentations that we've had over the month, we go ahead, if you have any questions, put those into the chat, and what will happen is Lisa will collect those, and then we'll go ahead and save those questions for the end, and Yvonne will go ahead and address those at that time. So as questions come up, plop them in there. We'll take them, and then we'll have questions at the very end. If you want to play a little bit with your Zoom, if you're looking at the presentation and you're thinking here, hey, these two videos are too big for me. I don't want to look at them. I want to look at the screen itself. There is a silver or gray bar just under our photos, and there's three lines right in the middle. So if you take your mouse up to the top, and you'll see, if you hover over those three lines, it comes into two arrows pointing up and down. If you pull down, it makes our photos bigger and the presentation a little wonky and pushes it down. But if you pull us up, then it brings the presentation all the way up, or makes our videos smaller, and then the presentation gets much larger and more prominent. So with that, I think I've covered everything we have today, and without further ado, I will go ahead and welcome in Yvonne. Yvonne, thank you very much for joining us today. Happy to have you on, and I will go ahead and turn it over to you for an intro and to get started with the presentation.
Terrific. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Scott. And it's my pleasure to be here with you today. And welcome, whether you are morning or afternoon or somewhere in between. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. And I hope that you will keep an open mind on how we're approaching this topic, because you may have thought, oh, well, we're talking about diversity in the way that it's most familiar to many of us. But I'd like to take the opportunity today with you to look at diverse work environments. And when I use the term diversity, I mean it from a slightly expanded perspective than what we would traditionally think of. So let's take a look at the concept of diversity, and I call this through various lenses. So looking at it from different angles, from different perspectives, beyond primarily, as we've thought about diversity before, primarily about from a human resources standpoint, right? So there's a lot more in looking at our environments, what those really mean, what do we mean by when we say environments, and then there's some characteristics or elements that apply to any or all or some combination of the environment. So all of that together, I think, is going to shape a different kind of puzzle that we're going to be looking at during our session today. So feel free to put in comments, questions. As Lisa said, we will look at those at the end of the presentation. Lisa, if something really hot comes up in the meantime, just feel free to interject and we'll be fine. So in looking at how we traditionally have used the terms diversity, and then of course with that comes the term inclusion. And then if we were to take that a step beyond, it's diversity, inclusion, and belonging, or diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So it's kind of a bundled package, if you will. But I'd like to focus today on the concept of diversity. Yes, blending of differences and personalities, the presence of difference, the variety of approaches in this case, not just from individuals in terms of ethnicity or race or their work experience or their neurodiversity, background, education, beliefs. So that's one segment of it. But again, I want to expand how we think of the term diversity and go beyond, I would say, what our traditional fences have been, right? What are the borders that we have set for us, for ourselves, or that have been set for us, right, in how we have approached the topic before. Just looking at it from a big picture point of view, because I think one of the essential things about property management is keeping in mind the bigger picture. It's not just the technical aspects. It's not just learning the rules and regulations. It's not just specializing in a particular area. So far this month, you've heard some really good presentations on kind of specialized areas within property management. I'd like to take kind of a step back from the practice of property management to where we do it, how we do it, why we do it, how our overall culture and environment, whether it's physical or virtual, right, affects what we're doing. And look beyond those limits that we have kind of maybe unconsciously or subconsciously kept in mind before. Okay. So I'd like to take a look at our different types of work environments. And I think sometimes here we also tend to think of just, well, it's work on site or work from home. We'll explore that a little bit more in a bit, but I'd like to, again, look at this from kind of a different atmosphere perspective, right, in terms of our different work environments. So there are several others, as I did some research on the topic, but there's several others that could apply, but I chose to focus on the ones I think that apply most directly to us as we perform the tasks related to property management, as we practice, if you will, property management, pardon me, as a profession. Because in a way we are practicing, we're always learning, we're always facing new things and new scenarios. So let's take a look at each of these a little bit and what the characteristics are. I have put these side by side on a 2 or 3 slides here, and the intent here is not to necessarily pin one against the other or to say this compares exactly to that. It's more about kind of exploring as we go through the 6 different types of work environments. What do they really mean? How might they apply to us? And when I get through this segment here, I have a few questions to ask. So be ready to answer a couple of questions and to put your responses in the chat. So Lisa, this is one place where perhaps I'm going to need you to read some of their input before the end of the session, okay? So in the conventional work environment, traditional work, on-site work, kind of the way, if you want to think about it, the pre-pandemic, right, way that we were doing work. Yes, we did start working remotely or working off-site or work from home, whatever terminology you want to use. That has been around for a while. It's not a foreign concept by any means, but historically, right, the traditional, the conventional way was to have a job like what we have in property management and to be on site to do it, to have a very routine process, to have a very set schedule, to be very systematic and hopefully consistent in how we do processes. And we also had and lived by a very well-defined set of rules and procedures. Now, I'm not saying none of these currently apply. I'm just saying, look at these in terms of the characteristic of that work culture or that work environment, if you will, kind of the mindset, right? The operational mindset that we encounter on a day-to-day basis. So in looking then at conventional, very, very traditional, I would say kind of in years past, the status quo, right? That was the expectation, was that. The anomaly was that we were working maybe offsite or remote or some combination thereof. So just keep in mind, framing from that perspective, the approach that was used from an operational management perspective. And then there's another work environment known as the enterprising work environment. Typically very driven, very focused on just the achievement, not just because it's not a small thing, but the achievement of organizational and financial goals. I like the terminology practice persuasion. And at first I thought, what in the world does that mean? I tend to think of that as actually a lot of what we do in property management, and that's maybe influence without authority. We may not directly supervise others, say, in our case, department property administrators, right? They're the local property representatives for each given department, but they don't report directly to us on a day-to-day basis from a supervisory perspective. We're also very often in the mode of, and this is persuasion, right? Of explaining things to someone, of convincing them why something is important, of explaining the value of a process. And sometimes in some environments, particularly in a profit-making environment, that can lead to a lot of competitiveness, of kind of, you know, who's ahead of the game, who's bringing in more revenue, who's generating more sales, who is bringing in more grants or contracts. So this can go way beyond just property management. But again, it's kind of looking at the mindset. What is the approach? Not right, not wrong. You know, it's just general characteristics for us to keep in mind. Again, thinking of this as, wow, there is a diversity, of course, in types of work environments, and they each have their own, I would say, their own personalities, right? Their own way of operating, their own way of making sure that business still happens and that it's done effectively. So in looking at social work, okay, the social work environment, yes, one would think this is just, oh, we're not social workers per se. This is, again, more about being very people-focused, being very hypersensitive to teaching, to guiding, to providing instruction, to understanding what makes people tick, right? The emotional intelligence, the empathy that's expressed with and for and to others and between others, understanding people's communication styles, all of that type of prioritized behavior, if you will, falls into kind of the social work type of environment. And then we have artistic, creative, free thinking, unconventional mindset, meaning, you know, we often hear the term, and we probably use it ourselves, right? Think outside the box, think differently. What can we do in a different way? So artistic is more, I would say, unlimited boundaries, and I know that's kind of an oxymoron, but it's more, it's different. It's kind of going with the flow, being very intuitive. And I like the concept of visual thinkers. Many of us tend to think conceptually, right? It doesn't have to be in writing. We don't have to have all the facts right in front of us, but we can visualize, hey, this is what may happen. We can deal a lot with, it depends, right? We're comfortable with that ambiguity. And not everything we do is always black and white. Although the regulations may say it's black and white because this is the expectation, right? The fact of the matter is that the situation or the scenario may not be as clear as we think it is. And it may have contradictory information going on that then we have to be able to articulate and express in a way that makes sense for our particular organization. Hopefully some of this is ringing a bell with some of you. Okay, then we move on to the investigative work environment. Problem solving. I think this is kind of our lapel pin for property management, right? We tend to be problem solvers. We need to be problem solvers. Oftentimes we get information about a situation when it's almost too late. I don't know that it's ever truly too late, but if we don't have enough lead time, we may need to be creative in how we solve a situation or think of alternatives. Understanding, this is where understanding the rules and regulations come into play, but then being innovative in how we approach problem solving, how we decipher a situation, the kinds of questions we ask. Interestingly enough, in this type of environment, research indicates that a lot of this work is done autonomously, meaning there's individuals, men, women, in the field doing work, doing research, asking questions, getting the facts together, right? Getting their ducks in a row, if you will, to then come back and report back and make recommendations. And oftentimes, again, according to research, these types of individuals in an investigative mode, if you will, they're not always managers or directors or VPs. Most often they are, out there doing the work, rolling up their sleeves, getting things done from a very practical, hands-on perspective. But I like to think that investigative applies to a lot of what we do, again, because we're problem solving, thinking a little bit differently, but trying to get to an objective that has already been a stated goal for the organization. And then there's the realists, right? The realistic. Now, the label on this type of environment is kind of interesting, but that is how they're characterized. And this is more by, hey, I learn by doing, okay? Show me something. Don't just tell me or give me instructions on what to read, but show me what I have to do. Let me actually do it, and that's the best way I can learn. Sometimes that is an approach we need to take when we're training or providing instruction to individuals, that type of thing. And in a realistic environment, if you will, the communication can be frank, direct, focused, very driven, sometimes almost on the edge of being perceived as rude, if you will, because of the directness. That's where we need to kind of step back and say, okay, what is the language we're using? What's the phraseology we're using? How is that really coming across? So our intent may be one thing, but how we come across and how we present it may be a little bit different. So another thing with this type of environment, because it's often very task-oriented, it lends itself to a situation where the individual or teams or groups are working on site. It's not necessarily a virtual environment. Although in today's world, almost anything can be in a virtual environment, right? So those are 6 different environments: conventional, enterprising, social, artistic, investigative, realistic. So here's questions for you. Put on your thinking caps. Which of these applies to your environment? Think about it. Okay, it may depend on, my choice is going to depend on XYZ. You can type some things in the question box there, and Lisa can take a look in a second. Well, it may vary. Today it may seem conventional. Maybe generally it's artistic. Maybe I'm in the investigative mode. Okay. It's maybe different every day. It may be different with each scenario. Okay. Or bottom line is we may just say, I'm not really sure. Let me think about this. And how does this apply to how I'm running the operation, how I'm contributing or participating? So 2 words come to mind that I'm sure you're very familiar with in terms of property, and they're right at the beginning of the first statement there. It may depend, and it may vary. Lisa, do we have any comments in the chat box on this?
We do, and it's right along what you said. It varies. Enterprising, investigative, and realistic depending on the situation. It depends on what is in. This one's a good one. It depends on what is unfolding on any given day. They're all good, but that one really struck me. It will vary due to field missions. Work environment varies every day. Conventional, but it depends on the day. There's definitely a theme, Yvonne.
Absolutely. And some of it may be driven externally by what is happening in the workplace. Some of it may be driven by our personal approach, right? And our personal mindset or that of our team, deadlines, pressures, all of that. But yeah, I really appreciate and agree that so much of what we do, and the comment, I think it was, it may vary on a day-to-day basis, right, Lisa? Something to that
Yes.
effect?
Yes.
Sometimes it's going to vary on an hourly basis. Oh boy, some of those days are a little bit crazy, but thank you on that. And keep thinking about these because, again, it's a different way of thinking of how we apply or how we work with, how we live through dealing with, if you will, diversity from all different angles, not just from an HR and a personnel perspective. So let's take a step a little deeper dive in this. So as we look at those different types of work environments, there are some certain what I call elements that characteristics, considerations, right, that we need to keep in mind. And they may apply to any, some combination, or all of those environments, depending on, again, it's going to depend on what's going on. But some key things to keep in mind here, okay? Regardless of what type of work environment, again, conventional, enterprising, etc., things to think about, okay? What is within your broader organization, okay? Look at the work group, your teams, your department, okay? What is our mindset? What is our philosophy? What are our guiding principles in how we do our work, why we do it? What's the degree of acceptance? And although we assume in this case, I think in most cases today, right, we assume that any job can be done remotely, or I put work from home, WFH. Work from home can mean anything other than on site, okay? And the difference in how I'm thinking about this is work from home is you don't have an assigned location on site. You can come at any time, but you're kind of a floater. You work in shared space. Remote, and that would be remote, right? Work from home means that it's part-time. You have a designated space, but maybe you come into the office or you come on site on a set schedule within a given week. Okay, so that's how I differentiate those two. Okay, other things to think about here. How far away are you in terms of if you work from home? Are you local, or are you out of the city, out of the state, maybe out of the country? Okay, accessibility. Now, accessibility is an interesting concept here because you're talking about access to information. So you're talking about data security, system security, clearances. Maybe it's physical accessibility. Maybe it is virtual accessibility. How robust is your internet in a given area? I think all of us struggle with this sometimes in meetings where we have to go, no camera because my bandwidth isn't my broadband isn't strong enough, right? So accessibility, again, is not just, here's another kind of level of diversity. It's not just about the physical accessibility, but the virtual accessibility, okay? All of that goes into play from that perspective. And in some cases, the degree or the percentage, how much an organization supports or buys into the concept of working elsewhere, right? Working from home or working remotely. It's really going to depend, in my opinion, it's going to depend on the type of work, okay? The fact remains, though, I don't think that concept is ever going to go away. We're not going to go to where we were decades beyond, decades past, where the assumption was everybody is on site all the time, regardless. So I think that is, and And I don't like using the term a new normal because, I don't know, it's kind of a, in a way, a very dismissive term. It's like the past doesn't matter, but it's kind of the approach, what is being expected as part of our routine way of doing business. So another thing to think about, regardless of environment, are the policies around working remotely or working from home or working elsewhere, if you will. Key things to keep in mind. Now, we may not be the policymakers. Okay? In fact, I would venture, I would take bets that most of us do not create, because these are more HR and performance policies, right? So we're not the ones usually generating these policies. However, these are things that had to have come to mind by those creating the policies. Okay, what is the optimum ratio, if you will, okay, of working elsewhere, working from home? Okay, is it 2 days a week? Is it 3 days a week? Is it 4 days a week? Is it permanently? Is it, and I heard a new term just recently, so there's hybrid, where you come on site 1 or more days a week, but not 5. Okay. Remote, where you're off-site 5 days a week and come in as needed. And then one of the newer buzzwords that I've heard recently is flex hybrid. Okay. So in hybrid, you have a kind of a set days. You come in my case, I often come into the office Wednesday, Thursday, right? Other than that, I work off-site. Now, is Wednesday, Thursday a set schedule, or is it going to be Wednesday, Thursday one week and Monday, Friday the next week? That would be the flex hybrid type concept. Ultimately, in reading a number of articles and write-ups about this, the important thing, the valuable thing here is to be able to give employees the choice, okay? Within limits, of course, because the priority from an operations standpoint is you want to be sure the work is getting done. But giving the employees a choice is really very, very helpful. Interesting. Several articles I read also said, hey, the exceptions to being able to work off-site or from home are new hires or underperformers. Now, tell me, if you hire a remote worker, remote meaning you're permanently off-site, they are not going to be necessarily expected to be on site. So it's kind of a contradiction in terms. But again, these are kind of questions that come into mind from a policy standpoint. Most important, and I totally agree with this, is that working off-site or working from home, working elsewhere, is a privilege, it's a benefit, it's not an entitlement, okay? And it does require some effective performance management, because it's very easy to let things, I don't want to say, but I will say, to let things kind of run amok, right? If you don't have the right tools and the right resources to have visibility of productivity and what's happening. Now, if you're saying someone can no longer work elsewhere because there's a performance issue, that also implies then that the supervisor comes along with that package, right? And also, if you're calling them on site, then they need to have some people there to help them along the way. So again, just another perspective, clarity in that policy. And I know over the last couple of years, you know, the policy definitions have kind of been all over the map. So sometimes it has added to the stress, but having the best possible and clear policies are really, really important. And then what about our actual physical workspace? Okay, physical or virtual workspace. Okay, so physical workspace, let's look at that for just a second. Okay, traditional or open, activity-based, bookable space. These are all kind of characteristics of how the space is physically organized, right? How it's set up, how it's subdivided, if you will. So if you were to walk into a building, what is the layout? What's the lay of the land within that particular workspace? So that's what these terms are referring to. And more often than not these days, organizations are looking at what in this slide is referred to as bookable space. The term hoteling, right, or shared space comes into play. Ergonomics, who's responsible? If you're working from home, Yes, the policy says you need to be sure that you have an ergonomically correct workspace. How is that verified? Who's liable if something were to happen? So again, these are all things that maybe we don't directly manage or directly make decisions on, but they influence, they're all part of the setting, if you will, the cinematic operation of how we have to manage what we do so we can do our property management effectively. Another thing I'll mention real quick on workspace is, what about equipment? Okay. What equipment is provided? What do you need to have? Does everyone have kind of standard equipment? Or are you working from home just on a smaller screen of a laptop? So those are all different things that come into play relative to the workspace. Any questions, Lisa? I know we were going to hold to the end, but just in case something is very topic specific.
There are no questions at this time.
Okay. Schedules, my favorite topic here. Okay. Interesting. Time zones, and I personally put this at the top of the list. If we're working in a diverse set of geographical locations, right? So oftentimes we have meetings in our group. We have people in 3, sometimes 4 different time zones. Sometimes those time zones are 1 or 2 hours different. Sometimes they're 10, 12 hours difference. Big issue in terms of coordinating and who's available, who's even alert, right, during a given meeting. And it comes into play because it really affects sometimes our productivity. One may argue that, hey, I can be more productive if my schedule's super flexible. Or other cases, it's like, well, how easy is it going to be disrupted? What are you going to define as your core work hours if you're dealing with different time zones? So there's a common amount of time, right? A common section of the day where everyone is presumed to be available. Things to think about. Equity, okay. Is there equal flexibility available? What about salary versus hourly employees? From a labor law perspective, do we need to treat those differently? Okay. How do we assign supervisory responsibility? Is that going to be a direct correlation? Is that going to all be online? How is that going to be handled? How is that going to be monitored? And then bottom line at the bottom of the screen here is, remember, we have all kinds of different arrangements for how employees and how many hours they are expected to work, how they're paid. Are they full-time? Are they part-time? Are they a temp, so they're full-time but for a short period of time? Maybe even volunteers, and volunteers oftentimes don't come into the payment factor, right? Payment for services, but it's about scheduling time and how much is expected to be reasonable for just a volunteer situation. So again, things to keep in mind, things to remember that also, if you're looking at, I guess you could stretch the time zones concept, but if you're looking at different geographical areas, right, maybe you also have different labor laws to deal with in terms of what applies. Not so much here within the continuous United States, right? But what if you're outside the country? Different rules may apply. Again, some of these are more from an HR standpoint, but indirectly, they all influence different decisions and different things we need to keep in mind to keep our operations running smoothly. People. I don't care how much you automate things, we still need people. My opinion, I will stick to that as long as I am living and breathing. People are essential, and not just the concept of an essential worker, right? As was used during the pandemic, that term, but having people involved, having people do some part of the work, having people facilitate decisions and discussions, okay? That is always going to be a key part of the equation. It's not all about automation, but a lot of it is always going to involve the people factor, okay? And again, diversity here, sure, from a more traditional perspective in terms of diversity, equity, and belonging, inclusion, all of that. Think of people also coming from different skill sets or different approaches to things. We have individuals that are deep thinkers, they're very analytical, they're very process driven. And then we have those that, and I'm not saying we're one or the other, right? We can be a blend more often than not based on circumstances. Improvers, they're always looking at a process with the eye of how can we make this better? Okay. Now, one word of caution, too much change, too frequent change in a process may not always be productive. If changes or improvements are implemented, give them time to work. Give them time to prove themselves out, okay? If it's a corrective action from an audit standpoint, you're not going to say, yeah, we implemented a new policy, we implemented the system enhancement, it went live on March 1st, you can now come audit me. You're going to need some time to have transactions run through to verify, to validate everything is still working. So instant gratification is not always the solution here. And then you have those that are physically involved. And by builders, I don't just mean physically putting things together, right? But builders in terms of teamwork, in terms of camaraderie, in terms of building relationships, building partnerships. And then we have those that are, I would characterize them as producers. They process transactions, they get things through the system, they make sure things happen. They may be a project manager, right, that keep things moving along. All of these are people from a different perspective, people with different talents, people that are diverse. Going back to the whole concept of diversity. And we will always, always, always have novices, newcomers, brand new people in property, and then we will have a kinder term, seasoned professional, right? Those of us that have been around for a while and have the experience, have different perspectives, have kind of learned by making mistakes, all of those things. So people are always going to be very, very important to the equation and to the process. Now, what about career development? People don't stay static. People shouldn't stay static. Now, not everybody always wants to kind of move up or out in the hierarchy of an organization, right? There are some individuals who do a great job, and that's what they want to do, and that's the scope they want to stay within, and that is fantastic. Some also want to expand, they want to grow, they want to move up into the career ladder, the career chain, if you will. So from that perspective, again, another way that this applies to any of those work environments we looked at earlier, regardless of what type of work environment. One biggest challenge, I think, particularly in a virtual workspace, excuse me, is maintaining visibility. So say we're physically in an office, physically in a workspace. Yeah, your people are in your line of sight, okay? You cross paths with them, you have more physical interaction, more physical presence. How do you maintain that visibility from a virtual standpoint? Participation, being invited into discussions or meetings. But I think this is not only important to keep in mind, but in a way, a little challenging, both from an individual perspective, right? How do I stay visible with my supervisor, with my team, with business partners or collaborators? How do I keep myself motivated? How do I keep that spark, right? Keep that energy in terms of always wanting or needing to learn and sharing the degree of experience. How do we get exposure to other teams? Okay, how do they know we're here? I mean, I may learn about some other project, but how do they know about me, for example, right? So different perspectives in terms of keeping in mind the flow of our career development. Another way of looking at it is your professional development. Okay. From a supervisory standpoint, how do you handle succession planning? Do you have a succession plan for your group, for your team, and for you personally? Okay. Don't forget that it's not just about the group we lead or supervise. You know, we're one one chess piece, I guess, in that whole puzzle. And how do we keep that? How do we make that happen? How do we take ownership of our own careers and development? Okay. How do we maintain jobs fresh? How do we expand the scope of those positions? And again, at this point, you may be thinking, Yvonne, what the heck does all this have to do with property management? It's all about the culture, the mindset, our ability, what frames and gives us the ability to perform our jobs. And whether we consciously think of it or not, all of these things we've talked about so far influence our ability to do our job, how well we do it, who we interact with, how we move through the day, right? How we move through the performance year, etc. So let's look at a few of the challenges. Okay. Some of them that I've mentioned a few minutes ago may already be perceived as challenges, but these are key things I think that we need to really keep at the forefront. Okay, being sure that we receive or that we're able to provide adequate tools and resources. Okay, software, computers, internet access, training, ongoing development, coaching, career coaching, all of those things, accessibility to data, delegation of authority, delegation of responsibility. All of those aspects fall under tools and resources. Any comments from anyone in the audience is, if you were to select one or two of your top priorities in terms of tools to be able to do your job, what would that be? What would that be? And hopefully we'll get a couple of responses to that in just a minute, Lisa. So while they're thinking, I will talk a little bit about collaboration. Okay? When we're in a geographically diverse or distributed setting, right? We're not physically present. Okay? I have personally found it one of the biggest challenges. Some of you may agree or maybe have a different perspective, and that's awesome. But maintaining that level of camaraderie, if you will, keeping collaboration across teams, sometimes can be challenging. We tend to very easily, we can very easily kind of fall into the mode of, oh, out of sight, out of mind. I'm just going to do my thing over here and be sure my part of the job is being done. So I think as a either individual contributor or from a supervisory standpoint, making sure that that ability to collaborate, that expectation of collaboration really comes into play. Lisa, do we have any comments on what anyone feels might be the most important tool or resource that they should be having?
We do. We've got a few. So one is trust. Another is a laptop. Someone else noted that they need employees to respond to email requests. That is the most important tool. Receiving proper data and an efficient property management software and communication is being noted. And then we'll put this in the parking lot for now, but something to think about toward the end is we also have a request for you to talk about your thoughts on the different generations that we have in the workplace now and how they should come together to meet the goals of a company.
Lord have mercy. I think that is a whole theme for another presentation. But yes, actually that last point really also comes into play when it comes to collaboration, because you've got generations, if you will, different expectations, different mindsets. And I love the topic. I want to explore it a little further Scott, let's make note to maybe include that in a future workshop. But that is a really, really important point. And I think in today's environment, if you will, we're seeing the amount of generations in a given workplace that need to work together. There's a broader spectrum, I think, than we have ever seen before. Okay, expectations, even how we do our work. You know, some folks are still some individuals, sorry, I keep using the term folks. Some individuals are still much more comfortable in, you know, paper and pencil, paper and pen, taking notes, having files. That's probably lesser of degree than it was a few years ago. I think that's one benefit, one of many benefits really that we've gotten out of the pandemic is we had to learn to be more virtual in how we do work. But the mindset, the expectations, how we communicate, language, okay, terms, things like, and I know I'm deviating just a tiny bit, but one example that comes to mind is, and this actually happened a few years ago, how we interpret, how we come across in something as simple as an email. I remember asking a question of a VP that I worked with a number of years ago. And, you know, this question was fairly straightforward, but I thought I would get like an explanatory, I guess you could say, response. And the response was one word, fine. Okay, is that fine, it's wonderful? Or is that fine, why are you asking, right? So how we interpret things can be very different. But I love the topic and I do want to circle back to that. So trust. Someone mentioned trust. Not only us developing trust, but us trusting others that we work with to fulfill their ownership, to fulfill their responsibility, to trust that others are doing their work, right? This conversation came up a while ago too amongst our directors, and our VP at the time says, well, hey, if you don't trust your employees, then maybe you're the one that has a problem because you don't understand their skill set and what they're doing and the expectations are not clear. So yes, there needs to be that personal trust. Now, on the flip side of that, I would say we need to be very careful and take ownership of the responsibility that we're not going to break that trust, okay? Because once trust is violated, what happens? Do you ever really get it back? One might think so, but there's always that question in the back of your mind, like, what if, right? So trust is really, really, really important. I think another aspect of kind of a whole new thing that has taken on a different level of importance is time management, okay? When you're not in a dedicated workspace, okay, how easy is it to get distracted? Just how flexible is your flex hybrid schedule? Does this mean, oh, I can schedule appointments at any time during the day and I can just go do that? Yeah, there's some flexibility in doing that, but just be careful that it isn't abused, right? That it's not interfering ultimately with being able to get the work done, at least during the core work hours that have been designated. And last but not least on this slide is the importance of providing feedback. Not only from a supervisor to someone you supervise, right? But vice versa, and across teams, across individuals within a team or within a work group. Being sure it's not always, sure, yeah, that's great, thanks. But are there questions? Did something come through clearly? Did the tone of something come through in a way that maybe you misinterpreted or interpreted differently? So providing feedback is very important. And how you do it is very important. Again, because we're gonna all come from diverse backgrounds, right? Diverse perspectives. So we need to keep in mind understanding where that's coming from. And of course, in all of this, there's a lot of opportunities. Using technology. I would say this second line here, focus on meaningful, critical aspects of the job. That's kind of elevated, right, to a higher level of priority. I think it's always been there. It's always been in the background, but maybe now it comes more to light kind of right in front of where we're doing it. And clarity in policies, procedures. I would add another word to that line, clarity, and some are better at doing this than others, and maybe it's situational, but clarifying expectations, okay? Not just, hey, this is the policy and the procedure, but what is the expectation of us as a team or you or me as an individual in how we carry out. And again, that whole notion of trust comes into play. Last but not least on this slide, I like to use the term become proactively reactive. And you may say, that's another kind of oxymoron, right? So think of it kind of in slightly different terms. Do we want to be responsive, okay, informative, or do we want to be reactive, where it's like we may not take the time to think about what we're doing. We may have to make quick decisions. Sometimes that's the only choice. But proactively reactive to me means, hey, I'm trying to stay one step ahead of the game. I'm trying to understand the bigger picture. I'm learning at what all the aspects of diversity are that I have to deal with, anticipating what might happen or what questions may be asked is really, really important. So in sharing this slide, and I'm not certainly intending to read all this in detail, but I just wanted to share with you from a supervisory management leadership perspective, okay? Some of the things also to keep in mind. There's a lot of information always being thrown at us. Different timing, different expectations, different priorities, different sense of urgency, right? So oftentimes, particularly with those that are learning a new task or coming on board as a new employee, just beware of overload, information overload. Sometimes also it even stretches to responsibility overload. Take a look at the workload that each individual within our groups has. Periodically, kind of rebalance that. Make sure that there's a shared responsibility, and that we really improve on our soft skills. Soft skills, communication, writing, tone, the ability to write clearly. Okay, we do a lot of things now via email or some sort of instant messaging. At Stanford, we use Slack, for example, kind of an instant messaging tool. And at first it was like, oh, wow, another thing to deal with. Now we use it all the time, right? But those soft skills, that empathy, that emotional intelligence is the term I'm trying to look at. So reestablishing kind of how we handle consistency, keeping our biases at bay, right? Or using them, in a way that it makes reasonable for that particular situation. And remember, ultimately, we do a lot of decision making and problem solving. Yes, there are established processes, but there's usually more than one path that can be followed to reach a successful outcome. That's for sure. Okay. So for continued success, I have no words. So I thought I'd put some pictures in here for you. Okay. Be sure we enforce and promote and encourage good collaboration, that we accommodate limitations that individuals may have. Sometimes it's a physical limitation. Sometimes it's an emotional limitation. Sometimes it's an access limitation, right? Competing priorities, personal life, work life balance, and making sure that we maintain a team spirit, a purpose for what we're doing, and that we're always progressive. We're learning. Okay? We ask a question or there's a situation, figure it out. Look at what all the little cogs in the wheel are, what comprises that scenario, so then we can come up with a solution. Okay? Encouraging, well-being, leadership. You got this. Yep, we're going to figure it out. It's tough right now, but we'll make it through, right? It's amazing what we can live through and learn from and come out successful at the other end. Okay? Customer service. Okay? Responsiveness. Someone mentioned in the chat responding to emails. Sometimes we get bogged down and it's, a few days later, sometimes things slip through the cracks and it falls. If you're expecting an answer, okay, say, please let me know by XYZ. And if you don't hear back from them, don't hesitate to follow up. As much as I would not need to have a reminder about everything, occasionally we all need reminders about something. And it's like, oh, thank you for putting that back on my radar screen. Just acknowledge the fact, be responsive, recognize, provide management support, team support. But in the end, the lower right-hand corner there, keep an eye on what the big picture is, right? We want to be sure that we balance all of these things, all of these attributes, the different perspectives, the different environments, the degree of diversity that we have to deal with in our day-to-day jobs, and just kind of in life in general. So I have a couple of thoughts to share with you. Now, I'm not a fan of a lot of words on a slide, but I really like these statements. And although they're not property related per se, I think they're reflective of kind of our thought process today. Okay. Alan Joyce, he is or was the CEO of Qantas Airways. And again, you may say, Qantas Airways, airline, not property management. Doesn't matter. We're talking about environment, mindset, work culture, if you will. Have a very diverse environment, but notice diversity generated better strategies, better risk management, better debates, better conversations, questions, and ultimately a lot of better outcomes than we may have expected. Okay? And this one is even a little longer, but these slides will all be available to you. You can read it in more detail. But interestingly, because oftentimes we think of the what's in our jobs. What do we do? What is a deadline? What is it that I have to worry about? What are my priorities? Let's take a step up and out a little bit more. Think of work, think of diversity, think of diverse environments, kind of as a way of thinking about both our individual and organizational behaviors, okay? And our individual and organizational business processes and structures. So a little off the beaten path from diversity, but again, kind of another twist. Ultimately, it's about how we build relationships, relate to others. And I really like, and I should have highlighted actually, at the end of the sentence, provides us with the power not just to survive, but to thrive and endure, okay? We need property management to stay. We need it to be an ongoing activity. How do we do it to the best of our ability? Okay. Ultimately, that's what it's about. And my goal for us today was to really kind of, again, think of a term or terms that we have been using in a slightly different way, a little more expanded version, okay? Definitions are not just black and white, pink or blue, yellow or green, right? They have many different perspectives and many different flavors, and how we include them in our train of thought, in how we manage work, in how we manage our interactions, I think really all come into play. So thank you so much for being here today and for the comments and the questions you've shared. Lisa, do we have any closing comments or questions?
We do. We have a couple. One is, you mentioned emotional intelligence. What type of emotional examples can you share with us?
So when I say emotional intelligence, excuse me, I'm going to take a sip of tea here real quick. I think it's a big topic, but two basic perspectives. Emotional intelligence is a lot about understanding people, understanding kind of where they're coming from, and our relatability to those individuals or to that situation, okay? Being savvy enough to successfully navigate, say, through a very touchy situation, a very sensitive situation, one that maybe brought a lot of pressure or stress along with it. So emotional intelligence is in a nutshell, kind of having the savvy, the skill set, the soft skills, the intuitiveness, right, to understand what's happening and to frame your response, because we only have control over our response, right? We may not have control over what's coming our way, but we can certainly control our response. How we do that the most effectively for the given situation.
A couple of other comments. There was one
Sure.
here. Someone noted that it's important to avoid performance punishment for overachieving employees and neglecting and avoiding the ones with sub-performance.
So yes, I think we need to be mindful in terms of recognition, and this is where, in part, where the visibility aspect comes in, right? So we want to be sure that we keep in our line of sight, whether it's actual or virtual, right? Be aware of the level of performance, the workload, the work assignment, and overachieving. It can be a good thing, but it can be a detriment too. So we need to manage that. That's appropriate for the given situation. Hopefully that answered the question.
Okay. And then we do have a request. Where would one go to get samples of the expectations that you referred to earlier in the presentation?
There's probably several different places. Let me do a little bit of research into that, Lisa.
Okay.
And I can put something together. Remind me in the next few days.
Okay.
And I'll try and get some notes out that we can make available to folks.
I will send the questions that are unanswered to you and the comments that are unanswered to you so that you can respond directly.
Excellent.
Perfect.
And thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. And thanks for listening and indulging me in being able to present this from a little bit of a different perspective. Appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thanks.
All right, and thank you very much, Yvonne, and thank you all for joining us today. Please join us again next week. We have our 5th and final presentation of Asset Management Awareness Month. Dr. Doug Getz will be presenting on, let me just find it real quick. I just had it on my screen for a second, and then I just forgot the title. He will be presenting on the importance of understanding in property and asset management. So please join us at 1 p.m. Eastern for that. If you have not registered, registration is still open. Just go ahead and visit the MPMA website and the AMAM page. So with that, thank you, Yvonne, very much for your time and for putting this presentation together. I thought it was really awesome and a unique and different perspective. So thank you, and thank you to Lisa, and thank you all for joining, and we will see you next week.
Scott,
Bye,
I have just a couple of housekeeping things.
Yes.
If anyone would like the presentation, they can email education@mpma.org and request the presentation. We will also have it online later today. We will also be uploading the presentation recording to YouTube, and that will be available hopefully later this week, and we will post the link to that on the AMAM page at mpma.org.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you, Lisa. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.